The wind came from the northwest without warning and without mercy. On the high plains of central Montana, January arrived in 1886 the way it always did. Not as a season, but as a sentence. Temperatures dropped below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius before the calendar turned. And by the time February showed its face, locals were calling it something they hadn't called a winter in living memory. A killer. But this story doesn't begin with the cold. It begins 6 months earlier, in the summer of 1885, with a woman named Marta standing at the edge of her property, holding a fistful of seeds and making a decision that every neighbor on that stretch of the Musselshell River Valley thought was a waste of perfectly good growing space. She planted sunflowers, not in a garden patch, not in neat rows for harvest. She planted them in a dense, staggered double wall along the north and west sides of her cabin, floor to eave height, 18 inches from the logs, running nearly 40 feet end to end. People shook their heads. Some laughed. One man said she'd lost her mind to grief. What they didn't know, what she barely knew herself, was that those sunflowers were about to become the most effective insulation system within 50 miles. And when the blizzard arrived in January 1887, it would prove every last one of them wrong. If you've ever been told your idea was foolish, stay with the story. And if you want a real frontier survival technique delivered to you every single week, subscribe right now. Every video on this channel is a solution that worked when lives depended on it. Hit the bell, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Marta had arrived in Montana Territory in 1881, part of a wave of Bohemian and German-speaking immigrants who had pushed west following land grants and the promise of something close to ownership. Her husband, Joseph, had built their cabin the same way everyone built cabins on the northern plains in those years. Horizontal log walls, a stone hearth on the south wall, a single small window facing east. Solid enough, adequate for a man willing to burn firewood from dusk to dawn. Joseph died of chest infection in the fall of 1884, leaving Marta with 3 children under the age of 10, a woodpile that would not last past February, and a cabin that lost heat the way a cracked pot loses water, slowly but without stopping. She was not an engineer. She had never read a book about thermodynamics. What she had was a memory of a detail from her first winter on the property, a small, unremarkable thing that most people would have forgotten. She had watched her chickens. On a cold November morning, she noticed that the birds weren't huddling in the hen house. They were pressed against a pile of dead sunflower stalks that had been left leaning against the east wall of the barn, dried stalks from the previous summer's planting, still standing in a rough bundle. The chickens were warm. The ground around them was noticeably drier. The wind was hitting the pile, splitting around it, and leaving a pocket of still air behind. Marta stood there for a long moment. Then she went inside and began to think. She didn't think the way an engineer thinks, in calculations and load-bearing diagrams. She thought the way a woman alone with 3 children in a Montana winter thinks. What works, and what do I already have? The answer, she decided, was already growing in her soil. In the spring of 1885, Marta planted Helianthus annuus, common giant sunflower, in 2 staggered rows along the north and west faces of her cabin. The rows ran 18 to 24 inches out from the log walls. The plants were spaced roughly 8 inches apart within each row, offset so that the second row filled the gaps left by the first. By August, those plants stood between 7 and 9 feet tall, with stalks nearly 1.5 inches in diameter. From a distance, it looked like a woman who had confused her cabin for a garden bed. From up close, it was something else entirely. Here is what Marta had, whether she named it this or not, engineered: a dead air chamber. The gap between the cabin wall and the inner row of sunflower stalks created a narrow corridor of still, trapped air. Moving air is cold air. Still air, even cold still air, is an insulator. That 18-inch gap was the equivalent of adding a secondary wall to the structure, not in terms of materials, but in terms of thermal behavior. Heat trying to escape through the cabin logs now had to pass through the log itself, then through that trapped column of air, then through 2 staggered rows of dense dried stalks. Wind deflection. The northern plains wind in winter is not just cold, it is relentless. It strips heat from surfaces through convective loss, meaning the faster air moves across a warm wall, the faster that wall sheds its heat into the atmosphere. By the time the sunflower stalks dried and hardened in autumn, they acted as a permeable windbreak, slowing the air velocity by an estimated 50 to 70% before it reached the cabin wall. Local accounts describe the lee side of the stalk wall as noticeably warmer to the touch on bitter days. Still air against the logs instead of wind. Snow accumulation as insulation. This was the part no one anticipated, including Marta. When the first snows came, the staggered rows caught and held the drifting snow between them. By January, the north face of the cabin had a packed snow layer nearly 2 feet deep wedged between the stalk rows and the log wall. Snow, particularly packed snow, has a thermal conductivity roughly 15 times lower than still air, but also creates an additional vapor and wind barrier. The cabin wall, by midwinter, was effectively buried on its most exposed faces. Fuel drying. The stalks themselves, once fully dried, could be harvested and used as kindling. Marta used the interior row in late November as a supplemental fuel source, leaving the outer row standing as a windbreak through the coldest months. None of this appeared at the time to be engineering. It appeared to be a woman who had planted flowers in the wrong place and gotten lucky with the weather. That was the charitable interpretation. The mockery was malicious. That's worth saying plainly. The people who laughed at Marta's sunflower wall weren't cruel. They were experienced. They had survived Montana winters. They knew what worked. Thick walls, a good hearth, a full woodpile, and a low-pitched roof to shed snow. They had built their cabins the same way their fathers and uncles had built them, and most of them had survived. That was the problem with being right in a community of people who hadn't been wrong yet. A carpenter named Elias Dorn, who had built several of the better homestead structures along the Muscle Shell, stopped by Marta's property in late August of 1885 to drop off a tool he had borrowed from her late husband. He looked at the sunflower rows for a long moment. "That's going to hold moisture against your logs," he said. "You'll have rot in 2 winters." He wasn't entirely wrong to worry. Moisture against log walls is a legitimate concern in wet climates. But the Montana High Plains are not a wet climate. Annual precipitation in that region averages between 12 and 15 inches, most of it falling as snow that drifts rather than soaks. The trapped snow against a wall would compress and insulate. It would not saturate the wood the way rain against a wall would. Dorn didn't know that. He knew what he knew, which was carpentry in a wetter part of the country. The man who ran the general store in the nearest town, a dry goods merchant named Ruck, according to fragmentary local records, made a joke that traveled up and down the valley that fall. Heiselwoman's raising sunflowers to keep herself warm. Might as well try to heat a barn with a hat. It got a laugh. It was, in its way, a reasonable joke. But jokes have a short shelf life when the temperature hits minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Celsius. The winter of 1886 to 87 is remembered in the American West by a name that sounds almost gentle for what it was: the Big Die-Up. It began with a dry autumn that left the grass short and the soil exposed. Cattle ranchers across Montana and Wyoming had overstocked their ranges through the boom years of the early 1880s. When the first cold front arrived in November 1886, it didn't stop. By January, temperatures across central Montana had dropped to minus 46 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 43 degrees Celsius in some recorded locations. Blizzards followed one another with barely a day between them. The Missouri River froze solid enough to drive a wagon across. For the large cattle operations, it was a catastrophe. Estimates suggest that between 60 and 90% of the open-range cattle in Montana and the Dakotas died that winter. Entire fortunes, the kind built on grass and beef and borrowed Easter money, were erased between November and March. For homesteaders like Marta Heisel, it was a different kind of crisis. Not financial ruin, but simple survival. Keeping a fire going, keeping children warm, keeping the woodpile from running out before March. The storm that became most critical for the valley settlements arrived in the second week of January 1887. Oral accounts describe 3 consecutive days of sustained wind from the northwest, temperatures that did not rise above minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 32 degrees Celsius at midday, and a driving snow that packed against every north-facing surface like wet cement. Across the valley, fires burned through the night. Some families ran out of split firewood by the second day and began burning furniture. A family 2 miles north of Marta's property reportedly burned their porch boards on the third night to keep from freezing. Marta's cabin was quiet. Subscribe now. And stay until the end of this video, because the number that came out of that storm is the one that silenced every person who had laughed at those sunflower rows. When the storm broke on the fourth day, a neighbor named Henrik Swoboda came to check on Marta and the children. He had spent 3 days rationing wood, burning wet logs that steamed more than they flamed, and wrapping his family in every piece of cloth he owned. What he found at Marta's cabin stopped him at the door. The interior temperature, measured with a simple alcohol thermometer that Marta had kept hanging near the hearth, read 51 degrees Fahrenheit, 10.5 degrees Celsius. This was not warm by modern standards, but it was survivable without hardship. Her children had slept in their normal bedding. The water in her kitchen bucket had not frozen. Swoboda's own cabin, by his account, had dropped to somewhere near 29 degrees Fahrenheit minus 1.6 degrees Celsius on the worst night, just below freezing, despite burning wood continuously. The difference was roughly 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, in interior temperature under equivalent exterior conditions. But the more striking number was in the woodpile. Marta had entered the storm with approximately the same volume of split hardwood as 2 comparable households nearby. After 11 days, including the 3-day blizzard and the cold snap that followed, she had used an estimated 40% less wood than her nearest neighbor of similar household size. The mechanism was not mysterious. Once someone looked at it clearly, the dead air chamber between the stalk rows and the cabin wall had reduced convective heat loss through the north and west log faces. The packed snow that had accumulated between the rows added an R value equivalent to roughly 2 additional inches of wood. Not extraordinary, but real and measurable in fuel consumption. The slower rate of heat loss meant the fire could be banked lower overnight without the interior dropping to dangerous temperatures. A banked fire burns at a fraction of the rate of an open flame. Less heat loss meant less would burn to replace it. It was not magic. It was geometry and material science, arrived at by observation rather than calculation. One number from that winter was repeated in local accounts for years afterward. Marta's fire went out completely for 6 hours on the second night of the blizzard, and her cabin stayed above 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius the entire time. Her neighbors' fires had not gone out, and their cabins had still been colder. Henrik Swoboda didn't say much when he left Marta's property that January morning, but he looked at the sunflower stalks, now packed with wind-driven snow, plastered against the cabin walls in a dense, pale wall, for a long time before he turned his horse south. He came back in March, when the thaw began to loosen the drifts. He brought his son. Marta showed him the gap between the inner row of stalks and the cabin logs. She showed him where the snow had packed. She pulled a stalk from the outer row and let him feel how dry the log wall was behind it. No ice, no frost penetration, no sign of the moisture damage Elias Dorn had predicted. Swoboda planted sunflowers that spring. So did his nearest neighbor, a man named Petr Vasicek, who had heard the story secondhand and arrived to ask questions in April. By the following autumn, the fall of 1887, 7 homesteads within 12 miles of Marta's property had planted staggered sunflower rows on their north and west faces. None of them called it a thermal system. None of them could have explained dead air chambers or convective loss coefficients. They called it without ceremony what Marta did. Elias Dorn, the carpenter who had warned about rot, planted a single row along the north face of his own workshop that summer. He told people it was for the seeds. No one challenged that explanation. The technique spread the way practical knowledge always spreads in frontier communities, not through publications or pronouncements, but through one cold family asking a warm one what their secret was. Within 2 winters, it had become a standard feature of newer homestead construction in parts of the valley, adapted with local variations. Some families used dried corn stalks, others used dense brush bundles, and at least one family, according to a fragmentary county history from the 1890s, used a combination of stacked sod bricks and sunflower rows that reportedly held interior temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, even during the coldest recorded nights of 1888. The woman who had been told she was farming her own grave had, without intending to, solved one of the most persistent problems of plain country homesteading: how to keep heat inside a simple log structure when the wind refuses to stop. She hadn't invented anything. She had observed a pile of dead stalks on a cold November morning and followed the logic wherever it led. There is a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books or training or professional credentials. It comes from necessity, from being cold enough, scared enough, and observant enough to notice the thing that everyone else has walked past 100 times. Marta didn't know the term thermal mass. She didn't know that still air, trapped in a narrow gap, behaves like an insulating layer. She didn't know that snow, despite being frozen water, is one of nature's most effective insulators, which is why indigenous peoples of the Arctic have been building snow shelters for thousands of years, and why animals across the northern hemisphere instinctively den against windward drifts. What she knew was that her chickens were warm beside the dead stalks, and her children were not. That's the gap between folk wisdom and professional expertise that this channel keeps returning to, because it keeps maturing. The frontier engineers, the homesteaders, the indigenous builders, the immigrant craftspeople who had no budget for mistakes, weren't working with inferior knowledge. They were working with different knowledge, empirical, immediate, and tested by consequence rather than laboratory. A house that fails a thermal test in a Montana winter doesn't fail on paper. It fails in the dark, at 3 in the morning, when the fire has gone low and the children have stopped shivering because they're too cold to shiver. Those are the conditions under which real solutions get invented. Marta's sunflower wall worked not because it was elegant, but because it addressed the actual physics of heat loss. It slowed the wind, trapped still air, caught insulating snow, and gave her fire time to do less work. Every element served a function. None of it cost more than seeds and labor. The lesson she left, and that 7 families along the Musselshell River carried into the next decade, is not that sunflowers are magic or that modern construction is wrong. It's that the people who understood heat the best were often the ones who couldn't afford to misunderstand it. That is a different kind of expertise, and it deserves a different kind of respect. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from, and what is the coldest winter you have ever survived? Drop it in the comments below. And if this story gave you something real, hit the like button and subscribe. Every week, a technique like this one. Every week, a solution that was called foolish until it saved someone's life.